Off the record.
So, okay, my job is done. Johnny honed his craft as an actor at Syracuse University, where he earned a BFA and received the prestigious Edward G. Greer Award for Excellence in Classical Acting. He has co-produced feature films with Chatham Light Productions and Multimedia Theater in New York and with Ring of Fire Productions. And in LA, he worked as a screenwriter as well as behind the scenes on feature films and TV episodics, including Bobby, There Will Be Blood, NCIS, and HBO's hit series Entourage. He's currently an associate artistic producer at Anthem Theater in Boston. So welcome, we're happy to have you.
So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. Beyond the introduction I received, I am a Massachusetts local. I grew up in Concord, Mass. As a kid, I could not have cared less about the rich history of Concord, Massachusetts. It was like, oh, get me out of here. This is so boring, So at a young age, instead, I became very interested in acting and in live theater. And so I learned everything I could about it. As Patty said, I got a BFA in theater from Syracuse and went on to live in New York and Los Angeles. And as the years have gone by, I am currently, I went on to found a theater company in Boston called Anthem, where we produce classical theater, comedies, musicals, everything in between. I also work for a tour company, a tour company in Boston called Boston Duck Tours. And this is my 15th season coming up with Boston Duck Tours. And when it all started, I was hired to do the tours. And now I hire and train people to do the tours. And that, in a roundabout way, is how I have ended up standing in front of you today. Because the training for that job required learning centuries of Boston history and Concord history. All of a sudden I went, oh, that town was really important. I should have paid some attention. And it required me to hone the ability to talk about the history in a way that people find compelling and they care about without, nodding off and falling asleep. So I am not an author with a book to promote. I'm not a credentialed scholar of history, but I am an enthusiast of the history of not only Boston, but how it relates to the rest of the world. And as I was telling this gentleman before this began, the thing that unlocks my interest in a subject is the human element of it. Who was there? What happened and why? And when you realize that people have ultimately been the same for centuries, these gigantic subjects in history or these huge battles or, the like, suddenly become so much more relatable. And you go, oh, it's because so-and-so was stubborn and they felt jilted, and so they sent 10,000 soldiers to do X and they countered with Y. And suddenly it's something to care about instead of name and date, right? So the talk that I'm here to give today is called Black Heroes of the American Revolution. And so, this month as we observe Black History Month, we honor the countless Black Americans whose courage and contributions have shaped our country. Today, we turn our focus on the Black heroes of the American Revolution who fought for our nation's liberty, even as they were denied their own. Now, this piece of paper I have, it's too small for you to read, obviously, but you can see even from a distance how many names are on this sheet. These are Black militia and Minutemen who were present at the battles of Lexington and Concord. And just a quick survey here. It has their name, their age, if we knew it, and what town they were from, and their freedom status. Were they free? Were they enslaved? Were they enslaved but had run away from somewhere? And so you have, Eli Perdue of Lexington, free, part of the militia. He served under Captain John Parker. We'll talk about him in just a minute. We have a guy, three brothers, it looks like, Thomas Ferret of Dedham, Caesar Ferret of Natick, John Ferret of Natick, all free men, all part of the militia. and their captains. So, how is it that this list exists and yet it doesn't? And so I will be fully candid with you. Before I found this list and before I got so interested in this subject, I myself had no idea that there were black soldiers at the battles of Concord and Lexington. And think about it. I grew up in the town, and the statue at the Old North Bridge is a white man named Isaac Davis. And the Minuteman statue at Lexington Green is a white man named John Parker. And these two guys, and the Isaac Davis statue, the Minuteman statue, is on the back of the Massachusetts State Quarter. All 50 quarters for 50 states. If you're like most Americans, and those statues and a painting here or there are all you know about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, then you have no idea that there were all of these brave black people standing side by side with their white counterparts fighting against the British Army. So, not to take anything away from Parker or Davis, these are brave guys. I'm just saying it is not the complete story. And so, in my small way, I'm attempting to fill in some more of the correct story. So the structure of this talk is as follows. At the beginning of the lecture, I'm going to introduce you to various soldiers and give you some context for why their contributions are still being talked about today. And then to finish the lecture, I will tell you what became of the soldiers and discuss the legacy that they were able to leave behind. And the pendulum on which this talk swings is not a soldier, but a poet named Phyllis Wheatley, whose story very succinctly demonstrates the powerful optimism connected with a new nation and how the hopes of that nation were dashed without proper support. So her story mirrors a lot of other stories. So without any further ado, let us introduce our first subject here. I will say before I go further that, the subject matter of the lecture can get very dark. We're talking racism, war. I will keep it as light as I can because I'm not here to bum anybody out, but just sort of, a warning about that. It's not the most pleasant topic in the world. But let's talk about this gentleman. He was born in Framingham, Massachusetts. He was born into slavery. He was, technically owned by a guy named Deacon William Brown. And in 1750, Deacon Brown was very upset, and he advertised in the local paper a 10-pound reward for the return of a runaway slave. I'm going to pause on his name for a moment. So that was 1750. 1770, this gentleman was in Boston. And it was unclear if you spoke to him or any of the accounts he left behind if he was free or enslaved or what. But he had gone to the waterfront, and he had become a sailor and a whaler and a dock worker. And he was not unique in this. A lot of black men who found themselves either self-emancipated or truly emancipated under the eyes of the law didn't know what else to do, so they went down to the waterfront because there was no room for the opinions of other people about whether or not you were a person or a free person. There's a book that was written by an author named Skip Findley, and it's called Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. Because if you're all alone in the middle of the ocean and everybody's life depends on whether or not that sail gets hoisted, it doesn't matter if the person next to you is purple. They are your comrade, and they are, your life depends on them and theirs on you. And so this gentleman found himself on the crew of a ship that had just completed a whaling trip and had docked in Boston to supply up for a merchant run down to North Carolina. And his name was Crispus. So Crispus finds himself in the middle of this crazy situation on March 3rd in Boston. This building still exists even today. We call it the State House, the old State House today. Back then it was called the Town House, and this is two different versions of the same event. Let's deal with this one first. So this is done by a man named Henry Pelham. And what he is attempting to do with his artistry is to commemorate this wild event where one soldier from the British Army was standing guard outside of the Custom House. He was guarding the money, it was his job. It was freezing cold, it was March, and suddenly this group of locals starts jeering at him, tossing a pebble to see what he'll do. He doesn't do anything. Let's toss a snowball at this guy, see what he'll do. He doesn't do anything. The soldier is starting to realize that he is outnumbered and he's getting scared, and suddenly a local kid comes up, a wig maker's apprentice, and starts yelling at this soldier that he hadn't finished paying for his wig on layaway from the wig maker, and here he is wearing it in public. And the soldier gets so sick of this kid that he hits him in the face with the butt of his musket. And the kid, instead of going home, goes directly into the tavern next door where his older brother has been drinking with his buddies, and the economy is in the tank, and everybody's disgruntled, and nobody likes the soldiers in this town, and here comes this teenager with the bloody mouth saying, the soldier outside just did this to me. Everybody from the bar gets up, they come out into the streets. Luckily for this one sentry, other soldiers had shown up, but it's still only 8 or 9 redcoats against what is becoming very quickly hundreds of Bostonians who are now openly throwing things and screaming, fire, 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 fire. Well, the soldiers misunderstand. They lower their guns. They shoot their muskets into the crowd. Henry Pelham created this print. Paul Revere created this one. Pelham and Revere were in a fight after this because Pelham had actually done this by himself, and the copyright laws of the time were practically non-existent. And so Paul Revere was within his legal rights to completely steal this image and put in a few differences. You'll notice all of the blood that Paul Revere puts in here. He also, this is my favorite addition that Paul Revere contributed, he names this place Butcher's Hall. That didn't exist. It was not there. But what Paul Revere was doing was he created a printing plate. This was an etching that he did, and he created a printing plate so that he and his buddy Sam Adams could use this event to get people on the side of Bostonians in their fight against Great Britain. And so, the British Army called this the Incident on King Street. But Paul Revere and Sam Adams came up with a much better name, the murderous, bloody massacre on this and this, and it's been shortened over time to the Boston Massacre. And it's a very, an indelible image of the American Revolution. So, one of the people that fell that day was Crispus Attucks, this dock worker who had run away from slavery in Framingham and kept himself busy for 20 years and ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time on March 3rd, 1770. And you'll notice the crowd is sort of nondescript here. You don't see anybody's, what color anybody is. And even these sort of, darker soldiers, this is meant to illustrate gun smoke and the chaos of the moment. It's not attempting to identify race or any other aspect of the people. The main point of this is to depict these soldiers as a well-organized and instructed force of violence against the Bostonians. As the court proceedings unfolded, it became clear that this was not at all the way that went down. There was chaos, there was confusion, there was not one volley, there were several shots that happened, and in the end of all of this, the soldiers were all acquitted of murder. 2 of them had the letter M branded onto their thumbs for manslaughter. And the reason that they would brand you on the thumb is because when you appeared in a court of law, you would put one hand on the Bible and you would raise your other hand to take an oath. And when you raised your hand to show the courtroom, that you meant what you were doing, it also was a signal to the judge and the jury that you had been convicted of something before. And so it might color your testimony. Anyway, incidentally, the defense attorney who got these soldiers acquitted was John Adams, Sam's cousin. So here you have Sam Adams creating the greatest piece of propaganda in American history, and his own cousin is defending the Redcoats and getting them acquitted. So I wouldn't want to sit at the Thanksgiving table between those two. So Crispus Attucks gets hit with 2 musket balls that night, and he passes away on the spot. So we know he was there. His murky past is unaccounted for, but we know very certainly that Crispus Attucks died that night. Let's move on to another guy. This obviously is a photograph, not a painting, so this is a modern reenactor, not an old 18th century guy. But he is depicting a man named Prince Estabrook. He was born in 1740 in Lexington, Massachusetts, and he also was born into slavery. His father was Tony Estabrook. And if you drive around Lexington, that name Estabrook is still everywhere. Estabrook Road, Estabrook Farm. They were a very well-off family, such that they could own people. Now, one of the most unpleasant, or more unpleasant aspects of this talk is the phrase systemic racism. You hear that on the news, people, their hackles go up. I'm a good person, what do you mean I'm not part of the system? But here's a perfect illustration of how a whole system can be rigged against you. Though provincial law prohibited Indians and Negroes, their language, not mine, from training as soldiers in the militia or owning weapons, they were still required to turn out armed during an emergency. So you couldn't own a weapon, you weren't allowed to train with a weapon, and yet if the militia was mustering and you didn't show up with a gun and knowing how to use it, you were going to get in trouble. The system was rigged against these folks. Anyway, wartime enlistment of black soldiers was controversial, but it was not unheard of. As I say, the militia members of Lexington, Concord, and beyond. So this Prince Estabrook enlisted in the militia under Colonel John Parker, who was the leader of Lexington militia. He was there on Lexington Green at dawn when these guys were outnumbered almost 100 to 1. 700 British Redcoats marched from Cambridge all the way into Lexington, and there were only 77 militia members standing their ground on Lexington Green. One thing leads to another, shots are fired. Prince Estabrook gets shot by a musket ball in the left shoulder, and he recovers from his wounds. And he serves continuously through the war under several commanders, Fort Ticonderoga under Colonel John Reed, just for one example. So we'll check in again with him later on. I will say, though, that these 700 soldiers here, these Brits, were led by 2 guys. One of them was named Smith, and one of them was named Pitcairn. Pitcairn, if you speak to his contemporaries, he was a man of honor, but he also had a fiery temper. And it was speculated that the way he engaged with the militia that day got all of his soldiers amped up more than they needed to be. It's possible that had his personality or his demeanor been different, there would never have been shots fired at Lexington. So because of the way he spoke to these people, they were disinclined to obey what he said, which made his soldiers mad, and one thing led to another. Shots were fired, the shot heard round the world. So, moving on. This gentleman, Peter Salem, born into slavery, 1750 in Framingham, Massachusetts. As a side note, what this has highlighted to me doing this research is we, in the Northeast, we sort of pat ourselves on the back and congratulate ourselves on not being the Southerners who participated in all of this slavery. And yet, not only in the early days of this are these people all from around here, but also after the war, the Northeast was very much complicit in cheating people out of their legacy. So we'll get into that fun topic in a little while. But at 25 years old, Peter Salem was freed by the guy who, owned him, Major Lawson Buckminster. And the reason that he freed him was so that Peter Salem could enlist in the Massachusetts Minutemen. So one of the things that I learned, in my readings was that not every militia member was a Minuteman. Minutemen were the very, very beginning of elite forces in the United States military. The militia could be any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Every once a month they get their hunting gun and they march around in front of the ladies and then they all go drink some ale and yeah, sure, they're doing their drills. But Minutemen were good at aiming, good at marching, good at following orders. They were intelligent and they could be ready in a minute's notice. And that is why they were the elite forces. And Peter Salem gained his freedom to become a Minuteman. And he was at Concord. He then went on to serve in White Plains, Saratoga, Stony Point, Valley Forge, Hudson Highlands. Keep in mind, they are walking. They are not jumping on an air transport to go from state to state to state. This guy walked all over the greater Northeast and fought in all of these battles. But the biggest contribution that got him into the history books was his presence at Bunker Hill, because he shot Major John Pitcairn, the guy who instigated the trouble on Lexington Green. Now this is, wait, that's Concord. My slides are never in the order I think they are. Hold on. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, so yes, this is Concord. So this painter is a great painter. He is a studied man. The detail with which he paints all of the equipment that these guys carry, the garments, the buttons, down to, look, these gaiters over the boots. This guy is no slouch. And yet, look at the faces. No people of color at all. White, 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 white. And I don't even know if there's malice in this artist's action of doing this. I don't know the guy, and I don't mean to malign him. But as I said at the beginning, if a painting like this in a textbook and the back of the Massachusetts Quarter is all you know about Lexington and Concord, then that's a whole chapter of this that you're not aware of. So this is the depiction of Peter Salem shooting Pitcairn at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And this guy was a known British asset. He was really quite a dynamo and a huge loss in a battle that they supposedly won. All right, now moving on for real. Salem Poor. So we just had Peter Salem, now we have Salem Poor. The name Salem they have in common, it's a biblical thing. In English, Salem, Massachusetts. In Arabic, salam. In Hebrew, shalom. It's all the same word. It means peace, ironically, in the context of this war. It means peace. But all of these guys are either being given or taking biblical names. He also was born into slavery in Andover, Massachusetts. He enlisted in the army after purchasing his freedom. So here's a guy who's not even really allowed to earn money. He has to sort of squirrel it away on the side, maybe get an allowance, maybe. And what he has to do with all of this money is pay to be free, and he gets the privilege of entering society on the lowest rung of society. You know, he uses his fortune for that. And that's another, you know, not to get heavy, but again, systemic racism. Like, he had to pay 27 pounds for his freedom, which doesn't sound like much, but keep in mind it's 3 times the amount of the reward that was being offered for Christmas addicts. 3 times the amount. He could have bought property. He could have bought a business. He could have done something that would have helped him propel his fortune forward with that money. But instead, he just got to call himself free and yet be treated like dirt, you know, afterward. So, Salem Poor was also at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he is credited with shooting Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie. And Abercrombie, so Bunker Hill battle, I won't get into it, but it was really gruesome. And one of the quotes that is always attributed to that is, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." It's a great quote. It may have been said at a different battle prior to that and cited again at Bunker Hill. It might not have ever been said at Bunker Hill. It is not known for sure that those words were said. But what we do know is that the instructions these these militia had was aim low, because muskets notoriously shot high and you didn't want to miss, and aim for the best dressed, the reddest of coats, because those were the officers, because the officers had money and they had fancier uniforms that wouldn't fade in the sunlight. And if they did fade, they could afford a new one. So as these soldiers were marching up the hill closer and closer and closer, if you had one musket ball left, you wouldn't shoot a guy with a faded pink jacket. You would shoot the guy with the scarlet red coat, because that's an officer, and not only are you taking all of his, you know, intelligence and war savvy down, but you're also getting 2 enlisted men to carry him off the field. So it's a 3-for-1 shot. So James Abercrombie was one of the people who ended up storming over the barricade at the top of Breed's Hill to end the battle. And it was gruesome and terrible, the bayonets and all of this. And as Abercrombie was storming over, yelling, "Surrender, you rebels," he gets shot by Salem Poor, the militiaman. So, moving on. Well, oh wait, this is a depiction of the end of Bunker Hill. This is dramatized a bit. There is a lot of accuracy to point out, but what is romanticized is the wrong word. I think dramatized is a little bit better. This figure, this is Dr. Joseph Warren. The title of this painting is "The Death of General Dr. Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. Very prescriptive title. But it was meant to mourn the loss of our biggest spark plug to that point in the cause of American freedom. A lot of people today don't even know his name because of how soon he was killed in this conflict. They know the name Sam Adams. They know the name George Washington. It was speculated that had Joseph Warren lived, that George Washington would have become an obscurity in history because of the charisma with which he led people. Anyway, he met his end at Bunker Hill, and this painting is all about that. But some of the accuracy we have here, you can see the ships in the harbor, they had been firing cannons. You can see the smoke pouring from the burning town of Charlestown. You can see that, you know, people are going at each other with bayonets and swords and sabers. And you can see, finally, some black faces. This is only a detail of the grander painting. There are some black soldiers depicted, and this, I forget who this person is, but it's a specific person that was definitely there. So Trumbull is the name of the painter, and though he is glorifying one aspect of the battle itself, he is adhering to, oh yeah, here is, so we're pointing up next to these flags on the top left here, you can see another black face. He is beholden to reality a little bit more than some of his predecessors.
What is that flag?
This flag here?
Yeah.
So this is, it's basically called the Bunker Hill flag. But I was reading something that, it may or may not have been flown. They weren't flying any flags at all. They weren't flying any standards. But if you go into Charlestown today, especially on or around Bunker Hill Day, there's a version of it with a blue field like this, or this one which is red, and they've got a pine tree. And sometimes this segment is drawn into quarters and the pine tree is only in one quarter, sometimes it's only a tree. So the colonials were adopting the pine tree as one of their banners. But whether or not, and I was in the top of Faneuil Hall, there's a military museum, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. They were formed, in 1775, and they still exist to this day. But now it's just war relics. And I said to the guy who is the docent of the museum, I said, what is the difference between the blue Bunker Hill flag and the red Bunker Hill flag? And he just looks, he goes, well, one's blue and one's red. So I don't know if the presence of this flag in the painting is revisionist history or if it was something that they were flying. But now that you've seen it, the flag, the tree is always in the top corner. Whether the field is blue or red is immaterial, and other variations are also, turns out, irrelevant. So this guy, Colonel James Mitchell Varnum, in 1775, he was ordered to supply troops. He was ordered by Congress to supply troops for the Continental cause. The problem was, they had already given all of the able-bodied white people that could have been soldiers. There were no other people left except for all of these able-bodied, eager and willing black men who wanted to serve. And so he made himself a decision. He was in Rhode Island, and he said, all right, well, Rhode Island is expected to have soldiers. I will provide soldiers. So he formed the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And here's a depiction of them. They marched from Rhode Island to Roxbury, Massachusetts in June of 1775 for the Siege of Boston. I will explain this briefly, but it is a big deal. So here's Boston back then. This is the north end. This body of water here, this thing would have been Causeway Street, so the TD Garden is right here. Museum of Science is like over here, And this is Boston Neck that this gentleman and I was speaking of before. This is the only piece of land that connected Boston to the mainland. Similar in it being a peninsula is Charlestown, Massachusetts. Also, as you see, almost an island except for Charlestown Neck. So the siege of Boston happened the moment there were shots fired at Lexington and Concord. All of a sudden, the peninsula of Boston was filled only with loyalists to the crown and soldiers. All of the people who were of middling or known rebel politics had to flee. And so the advantage was that they were isolated from the rabble by this neck, and they had fortified this neck. There were cannons and soldiers guarding this, so you couldn't just walk across. And the British also had all of their ships in the harbor. This was Long Wharf. This is like where the aquarium is now. And this is Long Wharf, and they had all these British ships, and they had free reign of the ocean, but they had no access to fresh fruit or vegetables from the countryside. And so as this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, there are written accounts of people in Boston getting scurvy from no vitamins because all they have is like salt cod and whatever they had in the stores of the ships. So the siege of Boston lasted almost 2 months. And every day, day after day after day, those soldiers who marched out to Lexington were then chased all the way back by the provincial militia and Minutemen, firing at them the entire way. They were lucky to make it back to the Boston Peninsula. Here you can just see the last couple letters of the word Cambridge. Cambridge Common where Harvard is. So it's just a big park. That became the headquarters of the militia. And so day after day after day, people were walking here from Rhode Island, from New Hampshire, from Vermont, from Connecticut. Some of the commanders that were present at Bunker Hill, Israel Putnam, walked all the way from Connecticut. By the end of 2 months' time, over 10,000 soldiers had gathered in Cambridge to face off against the roughly 7,000 soldiers in Boston. And so the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was part of that force. The Rhode Island General Assembly then voted to allow the enlistment of every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave who chose to do so, and that every slave so enlisting shall be immediately discharged from the servant of his master and be absolutely free. That was the promise of the Rhode Island General Assembly. These guys later went on to become known as the Black Regiment, very clever name. And they served all the way through the war. Various conflicts. Here is a depiction of the Battle of Bunker Hill with the British soldiers marching up to the redoubt. Here is part of Charlestown. You can see the rest of it in flames. Here they are in a different battle in a different state. These guys fought with honor. Now, moving on, we know this gentleman, General George Washington. Excuse me, I'm just opening a water. I need 3 more hands. Ooh, now it works. So George Washington had a big problem. This revolution was not going that great, and he needed more soldiers. But he didn't want black people having guns because he owned slaves. He was a known slaveholder in Virginia. And of course, you can follow the logic. If you're one white guy who is supposed to own hundreds of black men who are able and fit enough to serve in the military, and you give them guns, well, your little arrangement of owning them isn't going to last for much longer. So Washington at first was resolute in the exclusion of black soldiers. However, this guy, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, beat Washington to the punch. Because the British Army, what they were trying to do was disrupt the economics of this new country, the foreign country, disrupt the supply chain, break the morale, and force the hand of all these southern states whose fortunes depended on tobacco and crops and cotton and all of these textiles and all the stuff that slave labor brought them. They said, I know what we'll do. They made a proclamation. Number 1, martial law was declared. And number 2, look at this proclamation. This is a typeset version, but it was written originally. I hereby declare all indented servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels, free that are able and willing to bear arms. And so, oh wait, I love this part, all the pomp and circumstance at the bottom. Given under my hand on board the ship William, off Norfolk the 7th day of November in the 16th year of His Majesty's reign, Dunmore. And then just to prove that he's a good company man, he also slips in there, God save the king. In parentheses. Yes, of course. Anyway, so with this proclamation, this is barely a dramatization of what they wore. All of a sudden, all of these southern black slaves were seeing battalions of people who looked just like them marching past, wearing a banner on them that said, "Liberty to slaves." And so if you're sitting there working in the fields under the whip and you see this go by, you go, yeah, I think I'm going to enlist in the British Army. This is, how bad can it be? And so hundreds and hundreds and thousands of black soldiers started filling in the ranks of the British Army, which then made George Washington acquiesce, and we started allowing the enlistment of black soldiers on our side as well. Now, on the topic of loyalists to the crown, it brings me to this guy. Titus Cornelius was a self-emancipated slave. That's a cool way of saying he ran away. And he was from Monmouth, New Jersey, and he heard of the Dunmore Proclamation, and he went to enlist. So he joined what was called Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Norfolk, Virginia, he was at the Battle of Great Bridge, and Dunmore's regiment suffered a heavy defeat, and they disbanded. There weren't enough of them to keep going as a battalion, but a lot of these guys had gotten a taste for action, and they decided to start joining other regiments as best they could. And so Ty, as he was known, returned to New Jersey as a British soldier, and he fought at the Battle of Monmouth, and he became a black loyalist guerrilla leader. And as a testament to his valor and his leadership, he earned the unofficial title of colonel. So he became known as Colonel Ty. And he led the Black Brigade, which served in defending a unit called the Queen's Rangers in British-held New York. And they led numerous raids in Monmouth County, New Jersey, disrupting the American supply lines, capturing the rebel officers, killing the Patriot leaders. Now, we know this guy, the big face on the left, there's Ben Franklin. Nobody remembers this guy, even though it's Ben Franklin's son. Ben Franklin's son, William, was the royal governor of New Jersey, and he was a loyalist. And as I say, I was talking about the Addams cousins at Thanksgiving. Can you imagine? Look at the disappointment in Ben's eyes. Look at the fire in William's eyes. Son, when will you come to listen? Father, you don't understand. These two never reconciled during their life. And as almost an affront to his father, he started organizing, William Franklin started organizing raids all over New Jersey, and the Black Brigade was in charge of them. And so they worked with the Queen's Rangers, and they continued raids and looting and kidnappings and executions of rebels. They ushered escaped slaves to Canada. Forget the Underground Railroad. This was under the protection of the British military. They were getting these guys up to Nova Scotia. And this was George Washington's worst nightmare realized, because a lot of the people in the Black Brigade had served in the homes that they were now raiding. So they knew where the back door was. They knew how many weapons there were. They knew where the food was. They knew the escape routes. And so this guy, Colonel Ty, and his black regiment struck fear in the hearts of all of the people who used to own them. Now, different general. Oh, here's a depiction of Colonel Ty, obviously a reenactor, but look at this gunslinger. He's got this, what would be today a sawed-off shotgun. He's got a rifle on his back. Here he is in paintings, shooting people, picking them off. This is not a dude you want to meet at the wrong circumstances. Now, this guy, James Armistead, born into slavery, either 1748 or 1760. The dates differ. Nobody was keeping close track of these people. They were second-class citizens. Who cares, right? So we have two birth dates for him. 1781, though, he gets consent from his owner, his master, to join the Continental Army, specifically because of one commander. And that one commander is this guy, Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier. Who? The Marquis de Lafayette. That's Lafayette's real name. Anyway, Lafayette was this dynamo. internationally famous, like even just for going to this country to fight. He was a French kid with courage and money and brains, and he fought with George Washington their whole relationship about the issue of slavery. They had well-known, big, knockdown arguments about how can you ask people to fight for freedom when they are not free. That's a thing. But anyway, so Lafayette was a rising star in the military, and James Armistead's, owner said, listen, I want you to go serve under this guy. I believe in him. I believe in the cause. Go do what I can't do. So Lafayette meets James Armistead, and he immediately recognized his intelligence and his knowledge of the land. And so he decides that he's going to make him a spy. And so, posing as a runaway slave, Armistead is sent to infiltrate the camp of none other than Benedict Arnold, the most hunted, infamous turncoat in the entire Revolution. And Benedict Arnold takes in this runaway slave, and he realizes that he's very intelligent and that he knows the land. And so Benedict Arnold decides that James Armistead should be a spy. And so James Armistead becomes a double agent. He is spying for Benedict Arnold. He's spying for Benedict Arnold. He's spying for Lafayette. He's providing false information to Arnold. He's providing real information to Lafayette. And because of the work that he does and the clever manner in which he does it, his contributions arguably led to victory at Saratoga, which was the beginning of the end of the entire war. And so here is a depiction of Washington himself receiving intelligence from Armistead. We have victory at Yorktown. Did I say Saratoga? I meant Yorktown. This is a painting of victory at Yorktown. Here's another one a little bit more abstract. So after this, Armistead moved on to General Cornwallis's camp and continued his work, and his information allowed Americans to blockade British reinforcements headed to Yorktown, which secured the American victory and effectively ended the war. And here is, I don't know if you guys have seen or heard the musical Hamilton, but there's a song after Yorktown, and they're all singing, "The world is upside down." This is what they are trying to depict. Look at all of these British regiments surrendering and all of the people jeering at them. Their world turned upside down. Now, this is a bit of folk art. This is a watercolor by a French lieutenant, Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Vergères. And what we have depicted here, over here, this is a French artilleryman. You can see the French uniform, and you can see this weird serpentine thing. This is actually what you use to light the fuse of the cannon. And we have a frontier rifleman, and we have a New England militiaman, and here we have a member of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the Black Regiment. So even though the drawings of all these guys are crude, it is cool to see them represented by a fellow soldier. Now we're moving on to Phyllis Wheatley. This poor girl. 1761, a ship comes into the harbor of Boston, and this poor little 7-year-old, sick with disease, sick with scurvy, weak, is purchased by a family named Wheatley. They were prominent members of society, they were loyalists, and they decide to name the child for the ship that brought her here, the Phyllis. So that's how she gets her name. And she was, this is dark, but she was purchased more as like an exotic curiosity than as something that the Wheatley family was going to rely on for labor. You know, she was just a little girl, and they said, oh, let's get her. Okay, so one way or the other, she ends up living in their home, and she proves immediately to be adorable and smart and charming. And so they teach her how to read, and they teach her how to write. And then once she has gained, some ages and her health back, and she is just this captivating figure, she is serving the Wheatley family at their fancy society dinners. And so she starts meeting their friends and speaking with them. And she catches the eye of this woman who looks just like my favorite teacher from college. Shakespearean dragon, this lady, I loved her. Anyway, this woman is named Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon. And Selina Hastings starts taking Phyllis under her wing a little bit and guiding her in her journey of literature. And here's an example of the poetry that Phyllis began writing. On being brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Beautifully written, but I will say, sort of as a side note, later on in the abolitionist cause, Phyllis Wheatley's compliance with this worldview was problematic because she's almost apologetic that she's black. She's saying, remember, take pity on us. I am so lucky that I was snatched from Africa and shown the way and the light. And she wasn't trying to be provocative at all. She was trying to show how grateful she was for her religion, for her society, and her place in the world. She wasn't trying to be an influential black poet. She was just trying to be a poet. And later on, people started assigning all of these agendas that she should have had. But she was just a young kid writing her own poetry. Now, later though, she did start to have an agenda with her writing. This is a different poem that she wrote. And ultimately, she was writing this to... Hang on one second. She was writing this to Lord Dartmouth. He had replaced the previous Lord Dartmouth, who was a real nincompoop and was rather cruel to the American cause. And she was writing to him in hopes that by comparing her situation with America's, she could stir compassion within his heart. And so, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray, others may never feel tyrannic sway. So in this instance, she is using her plight to try to get some sympathy from this British lord. She also wrote, so anyway, I'll get to that in a second. Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon, assisted Phyllis Wheatley in publishing this book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And it was printed in London. Phyllis Wheatley actually went to London with this Selina Hastings. And, but here's the kind of gross part of the marketing here. They can't just say, hey, this girl wrote poems. It's like, oh, look at the curiosity here. Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England. It's like, it's a dark way of promoting this book. You know, the work can't just be the work. It has to be, can you believe she did it? Keep in mind, so I want to read one little snippet of her poetry again. I don't think I have a slide for it, but on the subject of slavery, she wrote, "In every human beast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance." So she's not without emotion, she's not without pangs for freedom, but her version of freedom is different than what was convenient in the abolitionist cause later on. Now, there is a statue of Phyllis Wheatley on Commonwealth Avenue, and I know that this photo isn't great, but the next one is great. And look how beautiful this sculpture is. It's life-size. You can walk right up to it, take pictures of it, with it. It's one of three. There are three women in the Ladies' Monument. It's Abigail Adams, Lucy Stone, who was a suffragette and an abolitionist, and Phyllis Wheatley, who we just discussed. Now, keep in mind, she was 16 years old during the Boston Massacre. She was 19 during the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, General Gage comes to town, Lexington and Concord happens, Bunker Hill happens, and George Washington suddenly is on the scene. Her world is crumbling apart. And there's a biographer of hers named Peterson who said the transformation of Massachusetts from a self-governing commonwealth into a military autocracy was sudden, abrupt, and devastating. And the matriarch of the family dies. And the girl that she came to know as a sister dies. These Wheatleys are dying off one by one. And she finds herself without emotional or financial support of the family that she knows. And the war is taking away her loyalist friends and her benefactors and her patrons. And so when George Washington enters the scene, she writes to him. She writes a poem for him. She writes, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading. Washington, be thine." It's not that she's a turncoat. She's just begging for normalcy. Her whole world is crumbling, and if he's the champion that the Lord is going to divine to bring us out of war, then okay, let's do it. So she writes to him, and a long time goes by, and finally he writes her back. And I'm going to read excerpt here. "Miss Phyllis, your favor of the 26th of October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this, granted. But a variety of important occurrences continually interposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention, I hope will apologize for the delay and plead my excuse for the seeming, but not real, neglect." This guy's going way out of his way to beg her pardon, right? I mean, for a man that owns black people, he certainly is respecting her, you could say, as an equal. "I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me in the elegant lines you enclosed, and however undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your great poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem, had I not been apprehensive that while I only meant to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity. This and nothing else determined me not to give it place in the public prints." Oh, so close to having her work published by what was going to become the leader of the new free world, George Washington. He says, "If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses, and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. I am, with great respect, your obedient, humble servant, G. Washington." Oh, it's heartbreaking all the way through. It's heartbreaking to see him pay her such respect, given the complexity of the fact that he owns slaves and what's up with him, his politeness, his humility toward her, and the fact that, depending on who you read, either the meeting didn't happen at all, or it happened but it was too little, too late, because what became of Phyllis Wheatley, her poems stopped being published, her friends were all taken by the revolution. Here's another wonderful view of that sculpture. But she ends up having to marry a grocer, a free man named John Peters, and he was a tyrant. He was terrible with money. He didn't respect her. They had some children together. They didn't survive. She ends up taking work as a scullery maid. She gets sick and she dies. And now she's buried in the Copp's Hill burial ground. Her life began in the wrong place at the wrong time, but she embraced her moment in the sun until this storm of war clouded the sun from her life. And her what could have been versus what is, I think, echoes a lot of the endings of these soldiers that I introduced you to before. So I'm going to go back through and we'll deal with them one by one. Crispus Attucks. Immediately following the death, in the streets in front of the old State House, he was brought into Faneuil Hall and laid in state. This was unheard of for a man of color, but it was convenient politically for Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, these Sons of Liberty. So they overlooked the fact that he wasn't white, and they allowed him to be in state along with the other victims. He was interred in the granary burial ground, along with the other victims, right next to Samuel Adams. Sam Adams actually reserved his spot next to the victims quite purposefully because he wanted forever to be tied together with them. So I want to show you a different version of this. Remember the Pelham print and the Paul Revere from earlier? This is another version of the same moment, but this is from the abolitionist years in Boston. And so this is also a bit of propaganda, but this time they're trying to steer it for social justice and social good, because remember before, nobody was really distinct in their race or color or anything, and yet Crispus Attucks is painted here as the central figure, the first to die in the cause of American liberty. So I just thought that was an interesting thing, 80-ish, 100 years later after the fact, this painting tells a different story. He also, Crispus Attucks, is immortalized in this. Now this is tough to see in this photo, but this you'll recognize as the Paul Revere / Henry Pelham thing. You see the victims here. This is a detail of the monument on Boston Common. This is the Boston Massacre Memorial. And here's a picture of the gravestone. This is in the granary. You can see people putting rocks there to pay tribute for the fact that they were there. And you can see all of the victims, Crispus Attucks, Patrick Carr, and Christopher Snyder. He was killed a couple days prior, but it's also really part of the same tumult in the streets. And if you're looking at this gravestone, to the right of it is the grave of Sam Adams. And you can even get a silver dollar with Crispus Attucks' likeness on it now. So I don't think his life was glamorous while he lived it, and it certainly ended in a hurry, but at least now he's getting some recognition, for being who he was. Colonel Ty, the loyalist guerrilla leader, terrifying. 1780, his battalion had a target, Patriot Captain Joshua Huddy. Huddy was well known for swift execution of loyalists, and they surround his house. There's a 2-hour standoff, and they wouldn't come out. They couldn't go in. One side's fighting with the other. They decide, let's light the house on fire. So they do. And all of a sudden, all of the people from inside the house start shooting their way out. It's a terrible battle, and Colonel Ty is injured in the wrist by a musket ball, and it takes him 2 days to die of infection. It was a violent end to a violent man doing violent things to other violent people. So I don't mean to make light of it, but I mean, his story is a good illustration of the fact that war is hell. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, they served their final days in Saratoga with low supplies and a terrible snowstorm. But then, Christmas Day, their discharge certificates are printed, 1783. And all of the white soldiers are informed that they have been granted a pension for the rest of their lives, and 100 acres of land. And all of the black soldiers sitting in the snow next to them are told, "You're free to go." That's it. No money, no land. They're in the middle of New York State in their battle clothes, and they are free to go. So eventually a petition for back pay forced the Rhode Island General Assembly to pass an act agreeing to look after only the soldiers that had become paupers, because the paupers of society were costing the white taxpayers money, and it was inconvenient. And so they said, "All right, fine, we'll give these bums money." But if you had walked away from the battlefield of Saratoga and made something of a fortune for yourself, you received nothing for the service you gave. So again, too little, too late. Peter Salem. As a free civilian, he worked as a cane weaver. He built a home in Leicester, Mass., and he married Katie Benson. They didn't have any kids. The marriage dissolved. And he struggled to make a living for the rest of his life. He worked in gardening. He worked in basket weaving. He repaired chairs. He died at the age of 66 years old in a poorhouse in either Framingham or Leicester. Friends pulled together enough money to get him buried in the ground, but they couldn't afford a headstone. So, in 1882, the Framingham townspeople erected a monument in his memory at the old burying ground. And the resolution on this photo is tough, but you can see his name, Peter Salem, soldier, and some of the battles in which he fought. So at least in death, he's being remembered. And this little thing, you might see this in New England cemeteries a lot. These are little flag markers that say that they were part of the Revolution. There are different versions of it, but if you ever see a flag in like a little brass holder there, go and check out what the holder says, because they are all significant. Salem Poor. He served at Bunker Hill. Colonel William Prescott is the guy standing on the top of the parapet in the paintings of that moment, daring the cannonballs to fire at him. He's the guy that is supposed to have said, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." He fought with valor. He led those men. It was arguably a Patriot victory as much as it was a British victory. And Salem Poor was getting jilted out of his money and honor and accolades. And so Prescott and 13 other officers petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts for, and I quote, "the reward due to so great and distinguished a character. We declare that a Negro man named Salem Poor of Colonel Fry's regiment behaved like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. To set forth particulars of his conduct would be tedious. We would only beg leave to say in the person of this Negro centers a brave and gallant soldier." There's no evidence that Salem Poor ever received any reward for his service. He gets married once, dissolves. He gets married again. He gets kicked out of Providence because of money issues. 1785, 10 years after the start of the war, he has to take out an ad in the Boston Gazette to disown Mary's debts, his wife, and forewarn all persons from trusting Mary, the wife of the subscriber. 1787, he marries a white woman named Sarah Stevens. 1793, he spent several weeks in a Boston almshouse, a poorhouse. Married the fourth time in 1801, dies 1802, and he too is buried in Cobb's Hill Burial Ground. In the background, you can see this is Old North Church. If you haven't been to Cobb's Hill, it's really beautiful and peaceful. And a lot of black people from that era are buried there. That was where they were all put as town zoning went. But he gets a postage stamp now. Great to keep his name alive, but I think what would have been more useful to him was to not have to purchase his freedom in the first place for 30 pounds, 27 pounds, and then live the rest of his days after giving all of his youth to this army, then live the rest of his life in poverty and squalor and then eventual death in a poorhouse. It's just such a bummer. Prince Estabrook, he earned his freedom during the war. I guess, the arrangement was honored. And he returned to Lexington after the war, and he settled in Ashby, Massachusetts. He had a good long life. He died at 90 years old. And in 1830, a grave maker made his headstone. Keep in mind all the things that he participated in and the valor he showed. The gravestone said, Prince Estabrook, Negro. That was his epitaph. Luckily, the War Department in 1930 got rid of that offensive thing and put a more fitting gravestone there for him. They replaced the headstone. And in Lexington, Massachusetts, this organization called the Alice Hinkle Memorial Fund gave him a fitting tribute. Prince Estabrook was a slave who lived in Lexington. At dawn on April 19, 1775, he was one of the Lexington Minutemen awaiting the arrival of the British regulars at Buckman Tavern. In the battle which followed, Prince Estabrook was wounded on Lexington Green. Through circumstances and destiny, he thus became the first black soldier to fight in the American Revolution. So the first to fight. Attucks was the first to die. He was the first to fight. This monument is dedicated to the memory of Prince Estabrook and the thousands of other courageous black patriots long denied the recognition they deserve. Now, after all these bummer stories, I have a good one. James Armistead. So after his integral role in the victory at Yorktown, James was forced to return to life in bondage. Because even though all of these people were emancipated because of their service, that was the arrangement that was made, technically you weren't a soldier, you were more of a spy. That's a different job category. So you're going back to where you came from. His white owner sees him coming home and goes, "What happened?" He said, I don't know. They told me no. And he's like, "But no." So, okay. The white owner of James was like, "This isn't fair." And he's, "Well, I don't know. I don't want to make any trouble. I did what I did." So the upshot was the white guy didn't want to own James anymore. He said, "Well, you're free, but I don't have enough money to give you what the army should have given you. Like, you don't have to call yourself my slave, but I can't give you a life." And so this owner keeps petitioning Virginia to give this guy his due. No, 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 no. Well, remember, he served under the Marquis de Lafayette. And years go by, and Marquis de Lafayette finds out that his confidant and spy friend, James Armistead, is still in bondage, and he freaks out. And he writes a fiery letter to the Virginia legislature. And then the owner and James go to the legislature with this wax-sealed letter from the Marquis de Lafayette, and finally they acquiesce, and they decide, okay, since the Marquis says so, you are free officially, you get a 40-acre farm, and you get a pension. So, years go by. So many years that the Marquis de Lafayette decides he is going to return to the new country that he helped form and say goodbye. And he does a national tour of all of the colonies. And like Washington slept here, Washington slept there. There's another whole trail of where Lafayette went. And he was just such a charismatic dynamo, this guy. And one of the stops, let me tell you one more thing. In 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette was the guest of honor at the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. And there were veterans of Bunker Hill there at the cornerstone laying. So 50 years later, you can imagine these guys are decrepit, and there's the Marquis, and there are cannons being fired, and there are parades and horses and all of this, and he is so moved by the ceremony and so honored to be asked to lay the cornerstone that he asks his attendants to gather trunks of dirt to take with him back to France so that he can be buried in it upon his death. And that is what happened. And so in Paris, there's this little private cemetery where an American flag always flies. And it's called Pipcus. And the dirt surrounding the coffin of Lafayette is dirt from Charlestown, Massachusetts. So one of the stops along the way was he spoke at the grave of George Washington, who had passed away. And there were thousands of people, not only to honor the president, but also to honor Lafayette. And it was thousands and thousands of people everywhere. And in attendance was James Armistead. And Lafayette is in his carriage and he's riding away. I get worked up. He's riding away from this whole scene. And in the throngs of people, he recognizes James Armistead. And he sees him, and it's been 40 years since they've seen each other. And Lafayette gets out of the carriage and is clawing his way through the crowds of people as Armistead is clawing his way to him. And in front of everybody, they embrace, and they're crying, and they're hugging. And Armistead informs him, "It was your letter that got me my freedom. And I have a farm, and I have a family, and I have a new name. I am James Armistead Lafayette." I love that story for every reason. And it was such a big deal to see this war hero hugging this black guy in the crowd. It was just a wonderful, wonderful thing for the cause moving forward. And so James Armistead Lafayette lived to a ripe old age with children and grandchildren and a farm and a fortune and a legacy, just like all of these other soldiers deserved. So to conclude, as a flag-waving little white kid growing up in Concord, Massachusetts, the 4th of July was always one of my favorite things. The horses come down the street and you get balloons. And then I remember as a teenager, I stumbled upon a quote of Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist from the 1800s. And it says, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." And as a kid, I was like, man, this Frederick Douglass is a stick in the mud. Why doesn't he, watch the fireworks? But once you study any of this, any of it, you understand that the cause has not stopped. The injustice from the 1600s to arguably present day has not stopped. So, this is Black History Month. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. It's absurd to think that MLK is related to the abolitionist movement, which is related to the revolution, which is related to the issue. It is the same thing over and over and over again. And the wrongs that Frederick Douglass was speaking of in the 1800s are still being, exercised, and with an O, in modern day. And so the protests that you see in the streets, it's all the same thing since the beginning of the 1600s, when Europeans took a look at this piece of land and decided to bring servants with them. So honoring and remembering the Black heroes of the American Revolution is crucial because their contributions were vital to securing American independence, and their stories have been overlooked or erased. Thousands of Black soldiers, free and enslaved, fought for the patriot cause despite the paradox of seeking liberty in a society that denied them the freedom. And so, the people in this room are here. You knew the title of the talk. I'm preaching to the choir. But so how can we help? I don't know. But I think the first step is in recognizing the holes that we have in our knowledge of these events and others like them, even when we care to know. The fact that maybe some of this is the first you're hearing of it. But when I was doing research for this talk, it was the first I was ever reading of it too. And I grew up in Concord, and I have read, 100 history books, and you really have to dig and dig. And so I guess to conclude on a bit of a high note, it is in our power to hold people accountable. If not in present day, at least tell them some of the facts of the contributions of the people we talked about today. And that's it. Thank you.